Hi, and thank you for joining me, Bruce Hallas, your host here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast for episode 4 in our first series. For those of you who are new to the podcast, let me briefly explain what it is that we're trying to do. We've identified a range of guests who have experience in the universal challenge of how to raise awareness, influence behaviour, and foster an appropriate culture when it comes to the issue of addressing information security within the context of the organisations that our community represents. The objective of the show is to have a conversation with these guests and to provide an opportunity for you to pull out key messages that you can take away and then conduct some further research around. And today is going to be a great example of that. So who is it that we're actually interviewing today? Well, Robert Madelin is our guest today, and Robert's got a really distinguished career. He first started off as a civil servant for Her Majesty's government here in the United Kingdom back in 1979. And as part of that career as a civil servant, he held 2 positions in particular at the European Commission. One as the Director General for Consumer and Health, and the second one as Director General for what was called DG Connect, which was basically, all things innovation, tech and digital. Currently, Robert's the chairman of the favour International. He's also a senior advisor for innovation at the European Political Strategy Centre. And he's also working with the World Economic Forum on the role of behavioural science in the formation of public policy. So with all those different roles that he fulfills, we feel really privileged that he's spared us an hour of his time to provide some ideas to get you all thinking. So why have we invited Robert onto the podcast as a guest? Looking at his career, I would summarise that he's been focused for quite some time now on the formulation of policy at a national and international level, which helps manage risks to societies, but also leverage opportunities that we all face. But whilst it's one thing to actually formulate a policy, he's been responsible for raising awareness of that policy. And as part of raising awareness, the intention has always been to influence behaviour, and therefore he has an understanding of the behavioural aspects of the challenges that we all face when it comes to embedding policy within organisations or even nation states or even groups of nation states. And on a final level, he's experienced in terms of how to embed something within an organisational culture, but also very aware of the cultural context within which you formulate policy and how you raise awareness as well. So I just think he's got a lot of experience in the universal challenges of awareness, behaviour and culture. And I believe that what with his digital background as well, there are key lessons there that we can learn in the information security community. So without further ado, here's the interview with Robert that we recorded a little earlier this month. Many thanks. So, Robert, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background.
So my name is Robert Madelin. I am a Brit, educated and brought up in England, and having begun life as a civil servant in Whitehall, I've now spent the last 30 years living and working on the continent in Brussels, mainly for the European Commission, but also at the earlier stages representing Her Majesty's government. And during that time, I suppose my experience was firstly to begin in the paper age and then to move slowly into the digital. And in doing so, to move from international economic diplomacy and trade negotiations through the field of public health and pandemic viruses into the world of cybersecurity and digital viruses.
Right. Okay, so that's a fantastic picture. And obviously really broad experience. In our previous conversations, I sort of mentioned the challenge that we're trying to look at here within this podcast is the challenge of awareness, behaviour and culture. What sort of role has that challenge played through that really interesting career that you've just described to us?
Well, I think the reason I went so far back into my career is that it strikes me that we are better at thinking about the integrity of processes and our lives in areas where we were born that way. So for me, my first brush with, let's say, data integrity and security was on paper and telephones. And there you have the Official Secrets Act and scrambler phones and ciphers. And that world felt fairly normal. But when you move into the internet age, it's completely different. And as somebody who wasn't born digital, it's more of a challenge. The second parallel, I think, is when I came from dealing with pandemic flu into dealing with cybersecurity as a policy challenge, it was very striking to me how much the nature of the challenges was similar and the nature of the responses needed to be similar, but human society makes it really difficult to execute.
Well, and can you draw any of those similarities? You obviously saw the similarity having worked in health and then moved into the area where you touched upon cybersecurity there. Can you draw any of those analogies between, sort of comparisons between us for our listeners at all?
So I think, firstly, the substance of the threat. It's not by accident that digital viruses and worms have these names, which are derived from the field of public health. And the danger with viruses is they spread faster than human activity can contain them. And they are impactful. All viruses are impactful. Those that spread quickly and have big damage effects are more impactful than those that spread slowly and may not have such big effects. So the way we think about cyber attacks and pandemic attacks really is the same. And similarly, in terms of our response, the fact that these are big, uncertain threats a little way away and they're rather difficult to understand by the man in the street or even the chairman on the board means that just as when I came into public health 2004, 5, 6, pandemic flu was a big threat and avian flu was a big threat, but people weren't doing anything about it. And then we made good progress there, and I moved across to the tech field in 2010, and it was just the same. The threats were visibly rising and reactions were not. And now I think we're beginning to get a faster increase of awareness and willingness to act, but we're still not there, and it will still take a few big shoves to get us there.
There you're painting the picture of the threats are there, but what's the level of awareness about the threats at an appropriate level? And if it wasn't, what were the challenges about raising that level of awareness so you can get it to a position where then people can start to make decisions?
So I think that the thing that we always start with in human society is explaining things to people. And it's actually the probably least effective means of motivation to do new things, but that's where we start. So in the public policy world, ministers and civil servants wander around saying to each other, bird flu is a threat, people might die, or cybersecurity is a threat, your critical infrastructure might go down. And people say, yes, that's scary, but then they put it to one side. So we next need then to sort of go to the architecture of human behavior, and either through additional incentives, you will get sacked if you do not keep your computer safe, or you will have to pay a fine if you let your customers' personal data out, to positive incentives, making it easy to update your passwords and virus filters. Then we move to sort of layer on ease of action and non-rational incentives or non-intellectual incentives on top of what's basically just a story. It's a very frequent experience, and I think it's probably the way we were all brought up as kids, and we haven't found a better way of doing it yet in human society.
So that's really interesting, because what you've done there nicely, I think, for the listener is you've sort of drawn a line between awareness and behaviour. So that sense of making ministers aware that there's a public health issue, then there's almost then you've got to obviously educate the public, the audience, of the existence of that issue. But then you've sort of drawn this line around the rational between actually influencing behaviour. Is that something that happens at a national level or an international level, the sense of the recognition that I can make people aware, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be, they're going to apply rationality to the information I give them and they're going to make a choice to follow good health practices? Is that what you're really highlighting there?
So I think yes, I'm highlighting that, and I think that, as always, we are a person. Each of us is an individual, and then we have families and communities, and they live in regions and countries and continents, and then there's the world. And pandemic threats like cybersecurity spread fast and know no territorial boundaries. So international cooperation is important for two reasons. Firstly, because you have to attack these things wherever they start and not just when they get to you. And secondly, because it happens to be true that there is a trickle-down effect. If we say the UN thinks or the G7 thinks or I agree with my European friends or with my NATO friends, that can be an additional motivator for the deployment of effort and resources at the national and regional and local levels.
Right. So in terms of that cooperation across the globe, the cultural context needs to be taken into consideration when you're trying to, I guess, to bring those stakeholders together behind an agreed almost mission. And two, do you think the cultural context needs to be taken into consideration about how people choose or whether they choose to comply with a policy?
No, absolutely. I mean, the second point, I think, is the most important, that people are people everywhere. I mean, Bruce Schneier, who's the big cybersecurity guru, gave a great talk in Davos one year that I happened to be at. And he said, I have a big, expensive burglar alarm at home, but it's always too much hassle to switch on. And he kept coming back to this example. It may or may not be true, but anecdotally, it really conveys that story that it's the human factor that makes us vulnerable. You install all this kit and then you forget to update your password. And so that reality is there all the time. At the same time, in public health, as in cybersecurity, there's little things which people can get the habit of doing. I turn off my computer, I change my password, I update my virus software. Just like in human health, we wash our hands. And those simple gestures can really save lives in both cases. The other point, I think, about international cooperation is different. I mean, pandemic threats are not bio-attacks by hostile powers. Cybersecurity is a mixture of failure and vulnerability to hostile attack. And when it's hostile attack, whether it's a state or a non-state actor, the way we need to cooperate to respond is different than if it's just H5N1 flu virus. So there are problems in the international cooperation space around cyber that relate to the G8 at the time with Russia in it not agreeing to act, Snowden deteriorating trust among the countries of the free world and so on. And those additional complicating factors make cyber security a completely distinct issue from public health biosecurity.
Okay. Is the role of understanding the cultural context within which you build maybe a program to make people aware, to influence behavior, the role of the cultural context behind the different stakeholders, if you didn't take that into consideration, is that going to have an impact upon the effectiveness of any awareness efforts that you may raise and any attempt to try and influence behavior in your experience?
Right, clearly, yes. I mean, I think that there are two dimensions to that motivational thing. I mean, it's all around behavioral economics, behavioral psychology. On the plus side, you have to make the right choice, the easy choice. So, you can prompt me to update my virus stuff, but if it prompts me to say, make a note on a bit of paper that at the weekend you're going to go to a shop and buy something, or you're going to go online now when you're busy doing other stuff and download something, that might not work. The other side is you have to create disincentives for ignoring the positive messages. So that can be around insurance premia, which is a growing market in the cyberspace, penalties for you disclosing my data by negligence in cyber, and so on.
So I wonder if we could just go back a couple of minutes to the issue of, you called it architecture of human behavior.
Yeah.
Could you just explain what you mean by architecture of human behavior for our listeners?
Sure. So remember, I'm an amateur in everything, and what you really need to answer that question is a professional behavioral psychologist. But the way in which we take choices as human beings is, as Daniel Kahneman puts it, either fast or slow. So fast is attractive because A, we're vulnerable, and B, we're lazy. So we're vulnerable. If we see a stick on the ground and it looks like a snake and we jump, well, if it is just a stick, it doesn't matter, we feel silly. But if it's a snake, we've saved our lives. So sometimes reflex thinking is helpful. Other times, reflex thinking just saves us thinking. So instead of constantly optimizing the journey to work, you typically go the same old way. So that's thinking fast. Sometimes you actually need to think slower. You need what, again, Kahneman would call speed bumps in your decision making, because it's possible to make you act fast, but then you may be hurting yourself. The classic example is all those online sites where they pre-check boxes that make you buy extra insurance or a GPS system you don't need or something like that. And we prohibit in law in Europe those pre-check boxes because they are tricking you into going faster than you should in taking decisions. So choice architecture is about putting in the speed bumps or putting in a default that leads you to do the right thing. So you could, for example, have a pre-check box that says, yes, I want my computer to upload the new software to filter viruses overnight. And the fact that the box was already checked makes it more likely that you'd say, yeah, okay, I'll do that. So that's what choice architecture is.
So that's the other phrase for it, which is that of choice architecture. And in terms of that description that you've given, is choice architecture really about designing the environment within which you make your choices?
Absolutely.
So could a health professional, as well as somebody from the security industry, are both of them actually choice architects in terms of they document within their own operating environment, whether in an organization within the finance sector or somebody within the health sector, they're really designing the environment within which people, employees, patients, customers, within which they make decisions which relate to health or security. That's really what they're doing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And when we talk about choice architecture or choice design, we sort of imply that there's always somebody designing. But actually, there is always an architecture which affects the way we behave in our environment, whether somebody has consciously designed it or not. So I would say everybody is, in fact, designing choice architecture all the time. And the only question is whether we do it knowingly.
Is another question, because I get that, are we doing it knowingly? It's another one in the sense of, if we're always designing choices in everything that we do, let's say with the health sector or cybersecurity, could it also be that you end up designing something without the ultimate goal in mind? If you haven't got something defined to move towards when you design those choices, could you end up getting distracted at all if it's just something that's happening without any real thought process?
Yeah, well, think about the days before road signs. There were hills in the days before road signs. And if you didn't know there was a hill and you hadn't got the brake on your wagon, it would go out of control. So that's what I mean in the sense that the real world influences the way things happen. And our choice architecture comes then when we consciously put in road signs that say, be careful, dangerous, bend ahead, apply low gear or whatever. So we intervene in our environment. But if you think about it another way, if we know, as I was just describing, that instinctively we want to go fast and take the easy route, then a failure to put some speed bumps into the design, whether you're designing software, a user interface, or a road, is actually itself a choice with a consequence. We know that something might be going too fast here, but we have failed to put in the necessary checks and balances. So there's a duty to be thoughtful about it, simply because we know that there is this design option and that it has an impact.
And have you seen, in your experience when you were Director General at the European Commission in relation to Connect, in your experience, do you think that, or have you seen individuals, organisations that where the Queen's dropped, where there's we've got this policy, whether it's a European policy or a national policy or an organisational policy, where they've said, we've invested all the time and effort into crafting this policy, but we haven't necessarily considered that behavioural insight piece that you were just talking about. How do people make those choices? Yes, it makes sense that people don't smoke, but people still do. So is that level of thought going on in terms of the behavioural insight piece, in terms of how we make people aware, with the objective being of influencing their behaviour?
So that's a great question. And personally, I work on this in a council of the World Economic Forum on the future of behavioural science. And the answer is, it seems to take humanity half a century to learn as a new normal something which was once a breakthrough. So it's already decades since Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for his work, and we still are at baby steps in applying it everywhere. So in the organisation I know best, in the European Commission, we appointed our first ever behavioural economist 10 years ago, and we still only have a handful, but we do now have a sort of behavioural insights lab which helps people to decide in all areas of policy, not just cyber, by the way, whether we are getting this right. And the same is true in the UK, for example, in the Financial Conduct Authority. And strange things happen when you actually apply this knowledge. You find out, for example, that things which everybody thinks of as useful, like forced disclosure, is useless. So forced disclosure is the economic theory behind food labels or all that financial information you have to wade through before you can sign for a mortgage. And you know what? People don't read the stuff, and the 3% who read it don't act on it, so it's useless. And so at least we now know that one of the things that used to make us feel as if we'd done our bit for consumers actually doesn't help the world at all.
Right. Okay, which is interesting because I know within the cybersecurity, information security context, that presents a real challenge in terms of, do people read the privacy statements?
The answer is no.
No. Which anecdotally, I think everybody knows, and there's also definitely been some research about this as well. But then you say, okay, so what's the value of actually doing this? What's the value to society?
Zero. That's exactly the problem.
Okay. Some people would maybe ask the question, so if there's no value, then why do we do it? Why does the law require us to do that?
Yeah, because there's a phrase in a very old English comedy program, which is, we need a futile gesture at a time like this. And it's a phrase which applies in many areas of human existence, and this is one of them. So it's, we grab for something. It's what some people call a do something policy. We have to do something, this is something, so we must do it. And now we understand that it's very ineffective. It's not extremely costly. And the fact that you are liable for telling lies in the statement and that you have compliance lawyers in many companies means that some companies do somehow run internal controls on their behavior because of these requirements. But the requirements don't do what it says on the tin. They don't empower consumers in any realistic way.
So the assumption that if we present the information to the consumer, then we're empowering them to make a decision. Whether or not they make a decision or use that information, that's sort of beyond the assumption is beyond our capability in a way. It's making it.
Or some people even say it's beyond our duties. But I think that the truth is that it's fine to say, we don't care. Caveat emptor, as they say, let the buyer beware. But at the moment, those who would actually be more laissez-faire in policy making try to have their cake and eat it, because they say, well, we put all the information in the hands of the consumer, which enables the consumer to take a rational decision. And the point is that we know now, because we know about the reality of human psychology, no, it doesn't enable the consumer to take a rational decision. And that's the uncomfortable truth.
Is it that, no, we don't enable the consumer to make a rational decision? Or is it that the idea that rationality is the way that people will first and foremost consume the data? Because there's two slightly different things, isn't it? One's an assumption that if we present the data, they will make it rational. And the other one is that they actually do apply rationality to it.
Yeah, I think the two are sort of mixed up in the sense that you're assuming rational behavior, and therefore you assume that if there is more data, then there will be better behavior and then markets function more efficiently. But it doesn't work like that. There's another trait of behavioral psychology called hyperbolic discounting, which is what leads us to say, I'll have a £5 now and not £20 at the end of the week, which is economically crazy, but that's what most people say. And the bird in the hand, as they say. So it's all about, I might be dead at the end of the week. Nobody's saying it's irrational, but it runs counter to the sort of rationality that we assume drives markets and behavior, including around stuff like cyber.
And all that sort of irrationality, is that going back to the phrase you used, the fast thinking side of things? It's the sense of, we have a gut instinct. We're almost programmed with a range of, I guess the phrase is cognitive biases and heuristics. And it's like these are filters before we get to the slow thinking, the rational side of human psychology.
Yes, correct. absolutely.
Why do you think that something that won the Nobel's Peace Prize, okay, which is this behavioural economics work that Daniel Kahneman did, why do you think it's taken so long to start to actually have an impact, in the sense that people have said, yes, it exists, let's start trying to apply that?
Well, I think it's something to do with the resilience of established ways of thinking. So the fact that it takes a long time proves that he's right. We too much have a sort of learn, work, retire model in our heads. So we're not in a learning mode all through our lives as a society. And so if everybody who's an economist learned about rational markets, then it's very hard for them to throw their whole life learning to one side and say, actually, markets are irrational because people are in them. So it's quite a big deal. And then what leads to the change? In this case, it's top-down leadership. So first, under Obama 1, appointing the people who wrote the book Nudge into the new president's executive team. And then, because that's America, other people following suit. In Europe, that would be the first Bulgarian commissioner for consumer affairs, Meglena Kuneva, and I are deciding to appoint some behavioural economists to the commission. And so it trickles on. And now you have hundreds of experts in this field gathering regularly in university symposia and so on to take the work forward. But until everybody's learned it at school, it's not quite mainstream thinking. So the cycle time is really slow.
So I guess the picture you're painting there, and you use Obama as an example of that, was you've got Obama, in effect, modelling on a chief executive, for example, and they would have a challenge around trying to influence behaviour for good. And they brought in that out-of-the-box thinking, out of the box in the sense of the status quo, in terms of people's skills and experience within that administration, but then parachuting in those out-of-the-box thinkers to then work with those people who currently work on the status quo and say, okay, between the two of you, what can we incorporate from behavioural insights to almost stack the odds in your favour that people are going to comply with, positive health choices, positive cybersecurity choices, positive pension choices and finance choices. And in a way, I guess that's what a chief information security officer needs to do within an organisation. They need to, once they recognise this, is to find ways of bringing those skills into their existing team.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, these people are hard to find now, though. It's quite a thin market. But, the choice design, the behavioural psychology stuff needs to be applied to these sorts of choices.
So if we could sort of maybe take a step backwards in terms of before people can make the choices, they've got to be aware of something there. When you think back to your role raising awareness of health across the European Union, what were the challenges that you could see in terms of, we have policy, we have an understanding of what is good health practice. What's the challenge of actually trying to get that message out to the people that are really going to make the difference?
Yeah. So the first challenge is actually different to those. The first challenge is that political systems don't want to be told that there is a new big threat out there that they haven't dealt with. They don't want to talk about it. And so a willingness to talk about things out there needs to be created, and it needs to be created in a safe way. So you need to have what, for example, the World Economic Forum has every year, a risk mapping exercise or a foresight or horizon scanning exercise in a company, in a country, so that the likelihood and impact of cyber can be looked at on the same page alongside the likelihood and impact of seasonal flu, pandemic flu, another outbreak of Ebola, etc., etc. And then you're beginning to educate everybody from the Prime Minister down, as it were, that there's this thing out there and it has to be looked at and compared with other threats in the real world, because we only have 24 hours in the day and finite resources, and we don't spend all of it keeping ourselves safe. We want to spend some of it making money, earning wealth, improving the planet, having fun. So I think that piece is really important to start with. And then the second piece is, you can do something to improve this. You will look good, decision maker. There's a net upside opportunity and the downside is not too big. And then you begin to slowly get traction. And then the third thing is to try and celebrate people all the way up and down and across organizations or communities who begin to get with that program. So you need not just to be sort of stopping people and saying, oh, you haven't got your seatbelt on, but rather saying, oh, look, that family has had all of its computers updated every time for the last couple of years. That's a gold star cyber household. And similarly for offices and divisions and factories and so on. And then the other piece that a lot of this is necessarily among professionals and covert, but it needs to be properly resourced. So you need enough doctors and nurses and public health specialists. You need enough certs and cyber experts, and they need to be talking to each other. So it's not all about persuading the general public or the generalist. It's also about the detailed professional peer groups, which are crucial.
Okay, so we come out from there, which is obviously really important, is you're creating a platform for discussion with the stakeholders that will make a decision about where they're going to invest their limited resources, aren't you? The World Economic Forum, that particular risk report, which is something we'll put a link in the podcast notes, that is a document I have been using now for quite some time, maybe 9 or 10 years, in terms of trying to understand global risks and how they might actually have an impact upon risk exposure around information security within an organization. Yeah. So it's a really good document that I recommend any of the people that are listening go and have a look at a copy of that. But in effect, you're raising awareness across the stakeholders so they can make decisions about where they're going to allocate their resources. And part of that awareness is the stakeholders understanding the value to them.
Yeah.
And then you pointed out there's what I call good news stories. So I know Kotter talks about, in terms of change management, the need to, at quite an early stage when you're raising awareness, to have some good news stories to tell, to create a sense of urgency. And then, okay, what are the news stories that are there to tell, which back up what you're saying? It's interesting, you spoke there about people being told off for not having their seatbelt in, but then you also flipped to the other side of the coin, which is these are the good news stories. In your experience, do you think the negative sort of punishment-driven need for compliance, if you don't comply, this is a punishment, how effective is that compared to using the other example you had, and this is a good news story where somebody's actually done that and this is what it's meant to them? Which one do you think in your experience needs to work better?
Well, I think it really depends what the nature of the threat is that you're dealing with and how you judge the vectors of the threat in society. So right down at the sort of wash your hands level, you're not going to start fining teenagers for non-compliant virus management, but you might be working with them through communities, schools, whatever, to make it attractive to them to be the good guy. And you might link that either to physical places like schools and pubs, or you might link it to social media. At the sort of corporate end, some companies are the vectors of potentially large amounts of cyber resilience or cyber vulnerability. And I think we're in the same sort of space as Grenfell Towers. Inspectorate and certification doesn't always do it, because the system can be gamed or ignored. I think that we haven't done enough yet, certainly this side of the Atlantic, around penalties for avoidable loss of personal data. And we haven't done enough for the insurability of liability for the avoidable loss of personal data. So I think there's both a question about what's an appropriate penalty and what's an appropriate insurable risk. And I think there are people talking about this stuff, but it's not very urgent yet, and probably it could usefully become more urgent. The bottom line also is to take a look at all of this and decide whether actually the risk is huge and life-threatening or manageable. I mean, in some discussions, if it's 2-3% of turnover, boards will say, well, that's the cost of doing business. We won't invest more in that. If, however, the cost is the hospital crashes and 25 people die before we've got it up again, then the government would want to be investing in that, because that's a safeguarding issue for the public authorities in a state system, even if the risk isn't big enough for a private supplier to want to insure themselves. So I think we actually need to have a serious discussion with ourselves about which part of those risks we accept and which parts we don't.
And it's only once we've had that conversation then that you sort of say that helps define how we motivate people to comply with any given policy, whether that be at a national level or an organizational level. It's the sense of, if this has a really significant impact, then you might want to use punishment. If it doesn't necessarily have a really significant impact, then maybe want to be using more positive stories to sort of get that message across about why somebody might want to comply. It was interesting. One of the people that I've been doing a joint workshop with at the moment with ISC Squared is a psychologist, and one of the things he's sort of highlighting was the success of punishment, and the sense that the research seems to identify that people are more likely to make a decision to not comply with a policy in relation to cybersecurity if they know that there's no 100% guarantee that they're going to get caught. And the other side was in the sense that if you position things in a positive way rather than negative, then they are more likely to comply. And another factor which came out in his presentation was the issue of trust. If employees don't feel that they are trusted by their organisation, they are statistically more likely to actually cheat, break policy, find some way around that. So I think it's quite interesting starting to see this information coming through on what motivates people to comply in given situations.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
Is there anything in relation to the cultural side when you were working with the European Commission, is there anything on the cultural side in terms of how you design policy? In my mind, I sort of get the sense of we might try and design it in almost like a clinical lab environment where we strip away all the cultural context just to come up with something, and then we ask our member states to actually implement that. Or do you take into consideration the cultural context as part of defining your policy?
When you say culture, you mean like the French and the Brits, or you mean...
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, I think that the major cultural differences in this space are more around age and digital familiarity than passport. So I would make the case that, you know, Xavier Niel and Mark Zuckerberg have the same digital culture, and Macron and them have similar digital cultures compared to, for example, Mrs. May and Mr. Johnson, who probably they have similar cultures, although they are the same nationality. So I've not come across a useful distinction by country, but I have come across distinctions by age and digital familiarity.
Okay. So I think what you just highlight there is interesting, because people talk to you and say, well, we want to embed information security in our organizational culture. And there's this belief, partly driven, I think, by economics, that this one-size-fits-all approach. So something designed in London, for example, which is going to be deployed across X number of countries all over the world, and the development and design of the awareness campaign around the policy decision is very driven by a London culture, a UK culture.
Yeah.
And I'm a bit of a believer that there are similarities, there are almost common denominators across different countries. And I think what you just alluded to there is a couple of those common denominators, the sense of that your age profile will probably mean that X, Y, and Z means something to you. Whereas if you're at another age profile, it might be A, B, and C. So within the European Union, you're saying that there were these common denominators that went across whatever the country is that you're in. Is that what you're saying?
I think in terms of the cyber set of issues, then yes. But I recognize what you're also saying, which is that in terms of how do I convey the message that I want to convey about action within my organization, yes, on that there are national cultural stereotypes to respect. And then on top of that, I need to develop the policy in such a way that it maps to the probably age or digital literacy-driven differences in the recipient audience, which makes life very complicated.
So there, in effect, we're saying there are stereotypes or cultural characteristics in different countries, but then there are also these common denominators that go across all the countries, or maybe all larger groups of those countries. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Is there anywhere that you've been able to reliably go to as a source of what are those type of stereotypes? Or is that down to your own experience of working in a very multicultural environment? Is it something that's more about your experience, or is that something that there are resources that you can go to that you've been able to tap into over the years?
So it's a bit of both, but I think it's mainly experience. But I think what I would say is that maybe the third layer here is that moving from wherever an organization is now to satisfactory cybersecurity behavior is a change management challenge. So you've got the, how do I say, do this in French and English and German and Japanese. B, you've got the problem, how do I describe this to the cyber illiterate 60-year-old and the born digital savvy guy? And then the third layer is, regardless of what I say, how do I actually get the change executed? And on that one, if it's a digital change, I think that the top-down instruction is only the start. The next thing you have to do is make sure that the user experience and not just the need to change has been dealt with. So that's a design thing. And the third is, none of these changes are just one-offs, and therefore you need to make sure that there's somebody who is expert comfortably within reach of all your individuals. And in a big organization, that means physically somebody has to be on the floor, and organizationally somebody has to be within the division. And so you may need several people in some divisions because they're spread over several floors. And even if you've got two divisions entirely on one floor, you need at least two people because they won't go to someone from out of their division if they can help it. So it's a very complicated area, and probably if we go on talking, we'll find additional layers. But there are at least those three layers: national preferences, digital literacy levels, and the need to make the process embedded by putting local lead users within unembarrassingly close reach of all the people who need to change.
I think that last point, when I was thinking about conversations I was having earlier today, the phrase that we often use are ambassadors, which is a very which is hired, from the civil service, the sense of ambassadors that are out there, and they provide the point of reference for all things relating to information security or health or whatever the policy area is. But they're not just about sharing information. They're also about gathering information and feeding that back up to the policymakers to help as part of the ongoing review process of that policy. So awareness is a two-way thing.
I think that's right. I mean, personally, having worked in the public sector, I think that the ambassador's label is not perfect because it sends the idea that, the digital ambassador is from a foreign thing called digital and will come and tell me what to do. And it's foreign, whereas I like to think of it as gardeners. So they're wandering around in a non-threatening way. Let's say English gardeners, not chopping things to size, but helping them to grow.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting, even thinking about that. The language that you use for the structure and the stakeholders that you embed within an organization to help raise awareness and influence behavior, how that language, how that name, something as simple as a name, how that can frame things for your audience. And it could be a positive frame or it could be a negative frame. I mean, my gardening technique would definitely be a negative frame. But, so ambassadors, gardener, I've heard people talking, security is really, the security role is one about facilitating. And it's interesting working with an organization where part of the brand challenge they had was a sense that security was done by the security team. Yeah. And therefore there was a sense of that's not my responsibility because we've got a security team. Right. And actually part of what the security team was trying to, I guess, address through a rebranding exercise was, no, we facilitate the business in this particular case to make decisions about what risk is and is not acceptable. And then we facilitate a discussion about what the potential controls could be. We have some recommendations, but it's the business actually makes a decision about what controls are going to go in place. And so they're trying to reposition themselves as the facilitator rather than the enforcer in a way. And they felt that facilitation was more of a positive brand than the way they were being perceived at the time.
Yes, I think that's fair. I think that is fair. So, but these are very fine-grained points. But I think what that tells you is that getting ready for something that, you think of it as a big black box you can label cybersecurity, but it actually requires a whole village to make a person safe from a cybersecurity perspective.
Mm-hmm. So in your mind, and with your experience and obviously your work with the World Economic Forum and this idea of introducing behavioural insights, have you seen anywhere where behavioural insights have been applied within the cyber domain?
I think to an extent, I would argue that the way my virus stuff pops up and says, oh, this site certificate is dangerous, are you sure? And then it really insists a bit. I mean, that is a speed bump. I think that something similar in terms of clickable links is an absent speed bump. And I think in big organizations, not only the ones I've worked within, you can see some of the sort of gardening ambassadorial change management as well. But it's not as careful as it always should be. So I think that, like everywhere else, probably behavioral insights are underweight, but that really is like everywhere else.
Cool. Right. Well, I knew that this would happen. We burnt through we burnt through an hour really, really quickly. Thank you very much for your time, Robert.
Thanks a lot then. Take care, Bruce.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Hi there. Well, I hope you found that conversation with Robert Madelin of some interest. You know, as I mentioned in the introduction to the podcast, Robert's background is in the formulation of policy and then making people aware of that policy, designing policy in a way which really stacks the odds in the favour that people will comply with that policy. And then as part of that overall process, he's had to take into consideration, even at the policy formulation point, you know, the role of culture, the context within which his audience for bringing about change live their lives, and how that may have an effect upon, one, the policy itself, but also two, in terms of how you go around raising awareness and embedding that within different institutions or even nation states in Robert's experience. And I think those universal challenges are the same challenges that security professionals face day in, day out when it comes to, you know, rethinking the human factor. As usual, I write quite a few notes. In this case, I wrote 6 pages, but what I want to just quickly flick through are some key notes. Some of them are just really just bullet points for you to take away if you haven't been able to make those notes whilst listening to the podcast, and to go away and investigate a little further. I think you summarized things really nicely by saying, look, it's the human factor that makes us vulnerable. And part of understanding that it's the human factor requires us to understand what he called the architecture of human behavior. And this is really, really important. And this has been a core part to my mission over the last 6 years in the security industry, about raising awareness of the importance of integrating behavioral economics and psychology and something called choice architecture when it comes to the design of effective education and awareness strategies and programs. Now, Robert talked about behavioral economics and psychology and choice architecture, and he referenced a gentleman by the name of Daniel Kahneman and Daniel's thoughts around fast and slow thinking. So go away and have a look at those things: behavioral economics and psychology, choice architecture, and fast and slow thinking. Now, Daniel Kahneman actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for economics a couple of decades ago in relation to his research, which highlighted what I guess many people knew anecdotally, but this was research-based statements around behavior. And Robert actually called this the uncomfortable truth. Now, I've never heard of it called the uncomfortable truth before, but I think it's an absolutely fantastic way of summarizing this. You know, the uncomfortable truth is that people do not respond rationally when you give them data. That any strategy for influencing behavior, which is based upon the concept that people are rational, is likely to be ineffective at achieving its objectives. And Robert highlighted the fact that there are government organizations that are recognizing this. He pointed out that Obama has said about introducing behavioral economists into the formulation of policy within the United States. He referred to work being done within the European Commission, again incorporating those behavioral insights. He talked about work being done at the World Economic Forum, about how behavioral science can improve the effectiveness of the formulation of policy and the embedding of that within nation states or in a series of nation states. And so for me, I think what he was really highlighting there, and this is absolutely critical to the security industry, if you base the effectiveness of your education and awareness on the principle that people will respond rationally to information you give them, whether it be small amounts or large amounts, that thinking has been proven to be not necessarily flawed, but not a true reflection of the majority of people out there that you're trying to influence. So the question is, do you include behavioural science in terms of how you develop education and awareness policies with the objective of being more effective? Or do you think, we're not going to do that, we're not going to use the science that's been out there, and we're just going to throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks? And then the final point is that one of culture profiling. Robert and I both agreed that, there are consistent themes which come across different cultures, and that actually the more traditional way of looking at cultures, i.e. in terms of national geographic boundaries, or I think Robert used the phrase passport culture, that whilst they're relevant, that there is this growing set of cultural trends which go through any country. And Robert talked about digital literacy and age, for example. And I know with our clients that, we also believe that there are consistent things, principles, values that go across all different cultures. So if you found that of interest, and I hope that you did, how can you stay in contact with us? Well, best way to stay in contact with us, if you're not using social media like LinkedIn and Twitter, is to visit the Marmalade Box website. And you can find that at marmaladebox.com. And on there, you can sign up to the newsletter. The news does a couple of things, but one of the key things it does is let you know when a new podcast has been published and what podcast is due. If you're interested in that awareness, behaviour and culture piece, then the newsletter will also let you know articles that we've written recently, but also articles that we found interesting, which have been written by third parties. The other thing that we do is we have a small book review where I highlight a book that has been really formative in my thinking around security, awareness, behaviour and culture. And then the final thing that we will do is there's an opportunity for people to send in a question, and I'll try and answer one of those questions from all the questions that are sent in on this podcast. So get writing. The other way of staying in contact with us, follow us upon Twitter at Marmalade Box. And the other way is to join the Marmalade Box LinkedIn group. And we keep that updated with articles, blogs, new podcasts that are coming out, and general information about the work that we're doing here at Marmalade Box around awareness, behaviour and culture. So who's our next guest here at the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast? Our next guest is a lady by the name of Catherine Kelly. Catherine is the Director for Prevention, Survival and Support at the British Heart Foundation. So they are applying an understanding of the science as it develops around better heart health, raising awareness of that across the whole of the United Kingdom. Then they are setting out to influence behaviour to reduce heart health issues. And then the real challenge, embedding that within the United Kingdom's culture. Now, I believe that she's got some great experience and insights to share. And, the evidence is that a range of the issues which cause bad heart health are being effectively managed throughout the whole United Kingdom. So what I'm hoping we're going to get from speaking to Catherine is, a very good understanding of the universal challenges that she has faced, that the British Heart Foundation has faced, and that even the National Health Service has faced within the UK. And I do believe that these will be common issues that most people in their line of work have been facing around the world. When can you expect that podcast to come out? That should be coming out towards the end of September. I hope that you can join us then. In the meantime, if you've got any views on the podcast, please do share them. And you can share them via either Twitter, LinkedIn, or on iTunes now, where we have a listing. Or maybe even just drop me an email and let me know your thoughts. Many thanks for listening. Bye.